Tom Golden and Janice Fiamengo speak with author Carrie Gress about her book, The End of Woman. For more content like this, go to menaregood.substack.com or to menaregood.locals.com, where you'll find red pill communities that are free to join and free from censors. Now, The End of Woman. Men are good, as are you. Indeed, men are good, and indeed, smashing the patriarchy has destroyed us. And today, Janice Fiamengo, who needs no introduction, and I'm Tom Golden, we're with Carrie Gress. Carrie Gress wrote this book, The End of Woman, How Smashing the Patriarchy Has Destroyed Us. Fascinating book, and I really enjoyed it. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a second, but first, let me tell you who Carrie is. Carrie Gress is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, a scholar at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America, and the founder and co-editor of the online women's magazine Theology of Home. She's the author of 10 books, including The Anti-Marry Exposed, a married mother of 5, and frankly, that may be the most important part of your bio, and she lives in Virginia. So welcome, Carrie. We're glad to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here.
Indeed. And let's start off by just talking about the title a little bit. The End of Woman. Now, woman is singular. The End of Woman. How smashing the patriarchy has destroyed us. Can you tell us what that means?
Sure. It's actually interesting. When I was working on the book, I came up with the subtitle first as I was researching it. And this idea of how smashing the patriarchy has destroyed us just kept coming back to me and really made me realize just how focused we've been on destroying something, but while we think we're doing something to help ourselves, we're actually, imploding culturally and whatnot because of our very pointed efforts at just destroying what we think is a bad thing in the patriarchy.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the title, The End of Woman itself, I think just really captured this sense that we're erasing women, and this is what we've slowly erasing a lot of the attributes of women, and we can get into this, but just getting to the point where we can't define what a woman is. We don't know how women ought to behave. We've sort of, all those blanks have been filled in by elite women and really a distorted culture. And so I wanted to capture some of that. So it was actually really hard to figure out what to entitle this book, because a lot of the names have been used and really in not savory ways. So of the things that we came up with. So it was a real challenge, but ultimately we came up with something that's been really effective and people have, remember it well, which is key.
Yeah. Interesting. One of the things that I loved about the book was that you look at the psychopathology of all of the feminists from 1792 until the present. I mean, it was very, very helpful to see this mapped out. I knew that a lot of these people were, in deep yogurt as far as their psychopathology goes. I didn't know the extent until I read your book. I mean, some of the things you came up with was like, oh my gosh, these people all really had a lot of troubles. They were troubled people. You call them lost girls in the book, I think, right?
Yeah, and that was kind of the overriding theme, really, of the certainly the first wave, and then you see it really bloom in the second wave. But just this idea of these very broken women who, instead of saying, maybe we have there's this abuse as a result of people behaving badly, instead they took the abuse and said, this abuse means that the whole system has to be changed. And, we can see that over and over and over again, even in our own day, where we sort of subjectivize negative experiences and think that means that the whole system is rotten. Yes. And so it's really interesting to sort of start seeing this pattern emerge, instead of it being like, these are very rational people who are making really rational decisions. You can sort of see the brokenness and the emotional reaction and response that has driven so much of it over the centuries.
Indeed.
And I found that really interesting, Carrie, because it always irritates me when the few public women in our culture who are willing to speak out against feminism often make the mistake of gesturing towards a previous generation of feminists who were allegedly the good feminists. And in fact, there's a whole book written by a scholar whom I admire greatly, Christina Hoff Sommers, has written a book called Freedom Feminism, in which she identifies women such as Mary Wollstonecraft and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony as good feminists. who, you know, inaugurated, you know, a genuine search for equality and a genuine freeing of women in order to enable them to participate in public life, for example, to have the vote and to have a say in public affairs. And it's always that idea that if we could only get back to that better feminism, we would be in good shape now. And
Yeah.
although I agree that, you know, some of the ideas about women's right to bear the burden of being full citizens, I agree that, that is important. But this notion that there was a good feminism in the past, I've never found that. I always found when I read those early feminists that they were driven by irrational hatred, by deep resentment and grievance, and by a utopian vision of what could be that didn't actually understand the facts of human nature and didn't take into account the needs of children at all. So I was really pleased to see that you did that investigation too.
Indeed.
Yeah, no, and that was really what drove so much of this book and this project was, again, just like you, I thought there was this lovely, pure first wave. You know, I had been told that for so many years, and my research prior to this was really on the second wave. So I thought, you know, I just owe it to myself to go back and look at the first wave and spend some time there because I had been really, you know, almost felt like I'd sort of had to hold my nose. I just wasn't something I really wanted to dig into. You know, it's going to take that would take a couple of days to look at, and maybe I'd find some nice quotes and comments that could be useful for research purposes. But I just had no idea what was really back there. And so when I started looking into it, I was just amazed and thought, how is it that we don't know this? How is it that we haven't heard any of this? And
Right.
you know, really even just the fundamental questions. I think, you know, the overarching question that I discovered that starts with Mary Wollstonecraft and really moves forward even to today. And I think this one question, when you see it, you realize that all of feminism has been animated by this, and it makes sense of even the trans movement that we're seeing today. But it's that question of how do we make women more like men? And but you know, but much of that was motivated by the fact that they thought fertility was such a liability, that women are vulnerable with it, and so how do we get rid of that? And also just seeing that, you know, the having this belief that men had an easier life than women did. So
Right.
why don't we
Right.
make women more like that? So that was a really interesting thing to sort of discover. But yeah, I had no idea of the connections with the occult that I found, the egalitarian issues, or that, you know, the idea of what became started out as egalitarian ideas of how do we get rid of hierarchies, and then moved more into what we know is smashing the patriarchy. And then, of course, even this connection with free love, that was another huge piece of the movement. So those three elements, I think, really helped me kind of define what first wave feminism was. And then you can see how easily second wave feminism happened once you know, identify, okay, well, they're
Right.
trying to get rid of any kind of hierarchy or any of these natural ways in which men organize themselves. They're trying to get rid of monogamy and the family, and they're trying to promote the occult. So all of those things we see in spades in our own day. But certainly, you know, it started from the very earliest stages, and that's really what I think hasn't gotten out. And gratefully, I think people are hearing about it now.
Yeah. Were you ever a feminist at all, or did you
I don't,
define yourself
I
in
don't.
that way?
Well, you know, I grew up in Eugene, Oregon, which is one of the most liberal places in the country, and I was not. I was very much like searching. My father passed away when I was a teenager, and so I think I was asking deeper questions than most people were when they're 19 and 20 or 21. But I also was, you know, I just didn't know. I hadn't really looked into it. I knew that there were, in many respects, probably growing up in such a liberal place and going to the University of Oregon, pushed me in the opposite direction because I saw just the devastation of people's lives. I saw people that were drugged out. I saw all kinds of people that were schizophrenic all the time on campus. In fact, I joked about wanting to make action figures based on these people because they were so interesting. You know, the guy named Frog who sold the world's funniest joke books and stood outside of the student bookstore every day and asked every student that walked by if we had seen the world's funniest joke books. I mean, there are all kinds of characters like this that were left over hippies. And so I think that dynamic really led me in a lot of ways to just say, there's got to be something better than this. And, I just kept looking. But in terms of the cultural mores that feminism has given to women, I absolutely took on a lot of those and felt like I needed to be ambitious and successful and outspoken and all of these things that in many respects didn't really suit my character, but I sort of felt like they were important. And it was really only when I got into my 30s and started paying attention and realized that most of my boyfriends were marrying kindergarten teachers. My ex-boyfriends would break up with me and then they would marry a kindergarten teacher. And I thought, okay, what do these kindergarten teachers have that I don't have? And so anyway, that was, I think, probably another way, these gradual ways in which I sort of abandoned what the culture was foisting upon me.
And what did you find out that they had that you didn't have? The kindergarten teachers.
They were nice and they were sweet and they were, they were kind and
loving.
And it was funny. I spent about maybe 6 months just sort of meditating on that, thinking about that, praying about it. Like, what does all that mean? I don't even know what it means to be sweet. And I even changed the way that I dressed. And the pinnacle of that experiment came one summer afternoon. I was at the Metro in DC, and some attractive young man walked up to me and said, "Are you a kindergarten teacher?" And of course I said no, but it was that moment where I realized I pulled it off.
You had arrived.
I had arrived, exactly. So not, materially I hadn't changed what I was doing. I hadn't changed my degree that I was studying for,
right.
None of that. But things like smiling and all of that. And that's, I think, one of the things that I've learned more, women learn this with motherhood. Like, being ambitious and skewering people does not help you at all in a family environment. And I really learned that raising children quickly, and of course, being a wife to my husband, just trying to figure out how do you best direct your family in a healthy way, and all of those things that I had been taught would never work in that environment. So
right.
I think that's another key piece of just learning what it means to be a woman and how to use things as in a virtuous way instead of allowing these vices to sort of undercut all of your best efforts and intentions.
Yeah. That's interesting. And that's kind of what we've lost too, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That capacity for women to have that capacity to be a kindergarten teacher and to love their husbands, to love their children. What a concept.
Imagine that. Well, and that's what the left has been so effective in doing, is they've really made it a very binary argument. They've made it, there's either the cool women who believe with everything that they are promoting, or there are kind of the Handmaid's Tale women that wear red bonnets and belong to fertility cult, or the Stepford wives, or whatever. These are women who are submissive and uneducated and all of that. And I'm actually reading a book right now that's coming out soon that just blows that idea up in terms of the women that have the most children, the 5% of us who have 5 children or more in the population. Most of us have at least a college degree, and that we're not uneducated doormats. That So anyway, it's really interesting to start looking at the reality and seeing that like everything, these binaries are not. That's what our mind likes. We like one extreme or the other, but they're not really based in reality.
So you said before, I wanted to go back just a second, that people who have children, 5 children in their families, usually have college degrees. Is that right?
Yeah, that the evidence is showing, there's a lot of research being done on it, that many of the women have advanced degrees, have college degrees or even advanced degrees, and that
That's
the real driver in it is actually religion. Not lack of education or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
Boy, that is fascinating. Go ahead, Janice.
It is. And the anti-religious, especially the anti-Christian underpinning of so much of first wave feminism is something that you touch on in your book as well. And that is quite interesting, I think, that from Mary Wollstonecraft through Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her friendship with Victoria Woodhull, and many others too in the 19th century, both in the United Kingdom and the United States. It seems that although there were some Christian feminists, often their Christianity was of a sort of renegade sort, and they objected to, I think, Christian virtues such as self-sacrifice and obedience and loving kindness and chastity and those kinds of things. And so, I found that very interesting. And I wonder if that also played a big role in your personal journey in rejecting feminism. Because it sounds to me like you do have a religious background. Obviously, you're interested in theology, and you went to the Catholic University of the United States. And so I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit.
Who were in the women's studies program at the University of Oregon. And these are the kinds of women that you would, a pack of men would be walking towards them, and they would like go around them because they just knew that it wasn't going to go well. These were really aggressive, angry women. And I think at that point I was very frustrated and felt like I don't know how to defend my own faith. I don't know how to defend I didn't know that I could do that. And so that was probably what really drew me into studying philosophy, was wanting to be able to rationally make arguments for my own beliefs. Of course, at that point, and I didn't really realize that the extent of it until I finished the PhD. But we're living in a post-rational culture, so all of these efforts to make these very tidy rational arguments were, sort of lost in a certain respect, because so much of it has to be made on an emotional level. But yeah, I think that it was really amazing though to go back and look at how much the occult played a role in early feminism. I think we can't overstate it. And someone like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, she was a myth maker. I mean, this is a woman who really figured out how to sort of brand herself as the original suffrage woman. In fact, the Seneca Falls conference that she put on, Susan B. Anthony wasn't even there, but they hadn't even met yet. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton realized how important it was for them to look like this original founding team. So she sort of wrote her back into the history of that. And of course, the idea from that came from her spirit table. I mean, this is the time of the Second Great Awakening in the United States. So you have all these people who are doing seances and sort of trying to connect with the spirits through these table wrappings, this knocking on tables. And so this spirit table that she got the idea for the Seneca Falls Convention and the Declaration of Sentiments, which was the document for it, that came from sitting at this spirit table with, having a seance. That spirit table is now in the Smithsonian here in Washington, D.C. So it's really amazing how deeply involved she was in very anti-Christian ideas. Yeah. She wrote this woman's Bible, which is sort of this, it's almost, I'm sure you've read it. It's very adolescent feeling, sort of like an angry 15-year-old girl is going through the Bible and like, this is bad and I don't like this, and making their suggestions for how the Bible should read. And then of course, she gets into her own, this whole messy scandal with Victoria Woodhull, who was actually known as Mrs. Satan in the U.S. press. She was the first woman to run for president. She had her own brokerage firm because she had been so successful contacting the spirit world for making investments that she was set up with her own brokerage firm. She was very much a proponent of free love. She'd been a prostitute since she was a little small girl. Her father had sold his daughters, regularly as prostitutes and had them perform as mediums and all these events. I mean, so there's some ugly, ugly stuff. And, eventually this is the part that doesn't make in the history books too, is, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was actually thrown out of her own suffrage movement that she founded because of all of these scandals. So I think that there's this revised history and very polished history that we get is just so incredibly inaccurate. And when people start looking at it, the pieces start fitting together a little bit better. Like, okay, this makes sense how we got to this point, this point, this point. And, even the way that communism really entered into feminism in the 1900s, it was just ripe for it because all of those elements that communism and feminism had overlapped in so many ways. Communists wanted atheism, and feminists wanted the occult. But they could sort of overlook those differences. But everything else was really, moving in the same direction. And so it just mapped onto it well for what we see in the 1900s.
Yeah, especially that idea that marriage was an institution that oppressed women and and that it should be abolished. It's incredible what a strong thread that is in the early feminist writings. And I mean, you mentioned Engels' uh, origin of the family, private property, and the state, where he makes this big argument about how the man in marriage, the husband, is essentially the capitalist oppressor, and the woman, the wife, is essentially the oppressed worker. And it's like, it's incredible that anybody could read that and think, oh yeah, that's true. And leaving aside the fact that the home that's created in a patriarchal family is a stable place for the raising of children and the companionship of man and wife and mutual support and all those kinds of things, to erase all of that and see that only as the arena of the sexual exploitation of a woman. And Engels uses terms like sex slave and prostitute. They essentially said that a woman in marriage was no different from a prostitute. And it's amazing the number of women who picked up on that language and started to use exactly that. And we see that, of course, in the second wave too, but even much earlier. So yeah, it is really remarkable, those alliances.
Yeah, and all of that goes back to William Godwin, who was actually the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft, and he was very much for the abolition of monogamy. He thought that marriage was a type of slavery. So you can see this, these patterns, these waves coming over and over again of these same ideas that are just sort of recycled and represented in new ways. But it's these exact same concepts of really trying to destroy the family and that space that it creates for a woman to become vulnerable, to have children. I mean, there's, pregnancy makes us very vulnerable, and we need the support. And, I think this is one of the challenges of having children today, is that, instead of getting support from people, you sort of get pushback, like, well, of course this is hard, but you're the one that chose it. Instead of looking at it as a positive good of what an amazing thing it is to be able to bring a new life into the world, you're really looked at as somehow suspect, or, creating this problem yourself. So anyway, I think it's amazing when you start seeing how early these ideas were already in the culture, and just how much they keep coming back in new forms.
Yeah, and it just reminds me that part of what you talked about was that marriage actually is a help as far as psychological health. It's like, I know from my own experiences being a father, it's like I grew so much because I had to deal with those kids and to deal with my wife, and she had to deal with me, and the kids had to deal with me. And it was just like the whole thing worked together, to really help me understand that I was not the center of the universe, at least not anymore. It's like now I'm out.
And that, I think, is really the key, and really what the early feminists wanted was this idea of, how do we get rid of children and husbands, because we want to be this ideal woman who has all of this freedom.
Yes.
And that actually was articulated by Percy Shelley, who was the son-in-law of Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. Mary Wollstonecraft never met him because he died. She died before before they knew him. But it's just startling when people realize that the foundation of feminism was actually articulated in the way that we understand it by a man, an English poet back in the 1810s.
Interesting. And it just breaks my heart that there's so many single mother families.
Yes,
that just
so challenging.
It's just crazy, and so much childcare. I mean, just the childcare too is like giving up the mother's love and handing this child off to someone who doesn't really give a crap. It's like, what are they doing? It's like they're missing the most beautiful part of life. I tell you, my favorite part of my life has got to have been when my children were small, like between the ages of 1 and 12. That was just a magical time.
It is.
And these people are missing out on the magic, Carrie. They're missing the magic. It's crazy.
But that's what they've been told, that's
I know.
drudgery. All drudgery. And from about 1900 on, that's the only word that feminists use for child raising is drudgery, over and over. So I mean, this is what we have been told, and we also haven't been prepared for it. I know myself, when I had amazing parents, But they went along with the culture in terms of what we're supposed to be teaching young women. So rather than learning how to cook dinner with my mom every night, I was playing tennis. I was played in college. That's how I spent my time. And now what do I have to show for? I've got some very good reflexes, but it took a long time to figure out how to make dinner. And to this day, my husband's still a much better cook than I am. He loves to cook and does a lot for us. When I'm busy. But it's incredible how much how hard it is when you've never cultivated these skills of motherhood,
Right.
whether it's cooking or organizing or even caring for children. It's a huge learning curve. So the difference between my first child and my fifth child. In fact, when I had the fifth child, there were certain points where I was like, "This feels a little bit too easy. Like, why is this so easy?" And so much of it was because I already knew what to do. I knew the habits. I also had older children that could help me, that were a huge help and still are a huge help. So I think on a practical level, we also have really shortchanged women. So that's where a lot of the frustration comes from, and the sense of not wanting to be mothers because we've no training in it.
Yeah, children are the enemy, as I think you say in one of your books.
Yes.
It's like that's what they try and say, is that children are the enemy.
Yeah.
It's absolutely mind-blowing.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
And Carrie, in your book, you're obviously you're writing the book primarily for women, and sort of calling on women to embrace what it means to be a woman in terms of self-sacrificing love as one of the primary characteristics of femininity, and motherhood as a particular expression of that kind of love. I wonder, like, when you think about what would have to change, or what would be involved in women's embracing of their femininity, like, would you, like, some of the difficult conversations I think have to do with this notion that now we're in a space where feminists would say, well, there's nothing wrong with a woman having children if she wants to, but they really push this idea that women should be fully involved in public life. Women should have, elite careers, many of which actually make it very difficult to have children at the same time, or even really to have a family life, even to look after your husband properly and look after your home. So do you see that as part of the change that you would like to see, that women would actually choose not to take on those kinds of careers as often, or at least not to feel necessarily that is part of their inevitable destiny?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing that really has to happen is that we have to get away from this idealization of the masculine. That feels like it's the fundamental piece. And when you really start talking about what women are, we've stripped it of any kind of connection to motherhood. Motherhood feels like, you can get a driver's license kind of thing. Like, you can do it or not. It's not really that big of a deal one way or another. It's not that important. And that's really what feminism has taken away from us, is this understanding of our motherhood, and not just biological. I mean, this also psychologically and spiritually.
Yes.
So every woman needs to understand that she's called to mother others, whether or not she has biological children in our work, whether it's in the workplace or in school, or whatever it is that we're doing. What women do in amazing ways is that we provide a shelter for people to grow into who it is that they're meant to be. So it happens on a nourishing level, it happens on a protective level, a comfort level, all these different ways in which we protect people so they can be who they're meant to be. And of course, we see all kinds of vicious ways in which that plays out, sort of the mommy dearest, or the over controlling or micromanaging kind of woman. And it's interesting to see who's the ones that are, it becomes about power. They use these female capacities to sort of control others. And we see this certainly in the workplace. I think so many of us have experienced it firsthand. So I think that is what we really have to start restoring, and then the other pieces sort of spread out from that, because in a natural way. Because if you understand yourself as a mother, and then you're not meant to be constantly in competition with men, or sort of elbowing your way to get to some sort of career status.
Right.
All of that sort of shifts and changes. And I think the real key is to get back to this idea of what it means to be a good woman.
Yes.
There's an interesting article or study I heard about recently where men could still define the difference between a good man and a real man. The good man was self-sacrificing and courageous and did all the kinds of things for other people. The real man was sort of self-indulgent and cut corners and all of that kind of thing. It was all more about himself. But we don't have that kind of division in our minds anymore in the Western culture for women. We just have the working woman or the successful woman, but we don't know how to even use those categories. So
Yeah,
anyway, I
good
think
one.
that's the real key is rather than
Yes.
saying you can't do this or you can't do that or you must do this, we have to start saying, what does it actually mean to be a woman? How do we embrace these things again instead of this idealization of trying to turn ourselves into being more like men.
And valuing women's capacity to love. This is the kindergarten teacher piece. It's like we really need to value that because it is irreplaceable.
Yeah.
You can't replace it. It's just so
No.
important. And
Yeah. And it's beautiful. And I think it creates
it really
a lot of
is.
wonder.
And
And
men
that's
respond to
really,
it too, like in
yes.
spades.
And
Oh my
that's,
gosh.
it's wonderful. And it's amazing too, just the tenderness that happens like you said, men respond to it in ways that are very
Yes.
surprising. And I'm always, it's easy for me say, get a reaction to say to a man that I write on feminism. But if I say I'm an anti-feminist, then suddenly it's a very different kind of conversation.
Yeah.
Very, very simply.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
I've really enjoyed looking back at poetry and music and that's the one place where you can get men in an unguarded way without being connected with the cultural junk that we're dealing with. And you can see, what is it that they love about women? Well, it's not, this argumentative narcissistic woman elbowing people and trying to get her way. It's the woman who can sort of take people into her heart and care for them and care for their needs and
Yes.
give of herself in a way that they are needed, not in this creepy codependence way, but in an ordered, beautiful gift of self.
And that brings out the same thing in men that he gives back to the woman. And you get this wonderful
Exactly. Yeah.
cycle going on. I've seen it
Yeah.
over and over
How
again.
is that?
Good
Right.
relationships have this cycle where one wants to do for the other responds, and it just keeps going. Bad
Yeah.
relationships, it's the opposite. No,
Yes.
I didn't get enough. What's wrong with you? You're complaining all the time. All that crap just takes things
Yeah.
down. So learning how
Yeah.
to really appreciate and love each other is just so critical. Oh
Yeah.
boy, I sound like a
Yeah.
preacher or something. But I think it's so true. And it just, the other thing, you talked about the natural mothering of women,
Mhm.
and the research is starting to point in this direction. There was this great study where they showed that parents, when the child comes in, both parents, when they get face to face with the child together, both get a burst of oxytocin, which is a hormone,
Mm.
right? They both get this burst of oxytocin. But guess what happens? The mother, when she gets the oxytocin, she gets what they call mother ease. Oh, baby, sweetie, woo, boo, 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 boo. She nurtures. She loves, right? What happens to the man? He doesn't go into mother ease. He goes into wanting to be active with the child in one way or another. If they're old enough, throw them up in the air,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
tussle with them or compete in some way. So
Hmm.
even our
Hmm.
brains are built to do this.
So hardwired.
Oh my gosh, I got a question for you. Of all the feminists you talked about in the book, and there was a lot of them, which one do you think was the worst?
Um, I Percy Shelley, actually, but I don't know that we can technically call him a feminist. No, I it's kind of a toss up because Betty Friedan was so evil, but and in a way that was very hidden. I mean, she used masterful use of psychology in her book, The Feminine Mystique, to really convince women that they were victims and that they had to get out of the home in order to be happy. I mean, we know that this was her agenda. But Kate Millett was so unstable, so mentally ill, so I think involved so deeply in the occult and all kinds of things. And I think I mean, she was obviously involved with the women's studies programs. She was also involved in a lot of ways with the mental health world, and one of the reasons why we don't institutionalize people anymore and people are out on the streets. Some of that goes back to Kate Millett. Even Iran goes back to Kate Millett. She and Simone de Beauvoir were friends with the Ayatollah when he was in Paris, and worked with him to try to establish this incredible women's revolution in Iran. And it's well documented that Kate Millett was there during the revolution. She was deported very, very quickly after it happened because, of course, he was incredibly disingenuous and had no intention of doing what he just wanted power, doing what she and Simone de Beauvoir were suggesting. Simone de Beauvoir shows up in Iran, same thing, deported very, very quickly out of it. So I think that on the scale of the international polemic and just mess that we have, I think that Kate Millett really has to be the biggest player, and she's not well known, but she's been under the radar. But her damage is just continually to ripple and cycle and
Yes.
be out there.
Yes. Kate over Betty.
I would choose Kate over Betty.
And I know you know Mallory also, right? And
I do know Mallory.
She has some stories to tell about Kate. And once you listen to Mallory for a while, you realize that Kate was really, she had some real problems.
Kate was not well. Yeah.
Janice
and
and I
think
interviewed Mallory
Kate's
a while back.
Yeah, even if you read her many of her books, you can tell Kate was not well.
Yes, yes.
And that was really hidden too, I think, by a lot of feminists, just how unwell she was, and how people just didn't talk about that aspect of her.
So,
Yeah.
how did a group of mentally ill females brainwash the world, many countries, both men and women, into thinking what they do today? How did they do that?
Yeah. No, I think that's the big question. I think because you have all of these people that were really wanting to promote communism in very surreptitious ways. I think that was part of it. They also had the advantage of television was new. And, you've got someone like Gloria Steinem, who she used television very, very effectively. Also with Ms. Magazine, like they were just able to really push over the narrative and invade every cultural element of
Mm-hmm.
of the country.
Yeah.
So politics, Hollywood, daytime TV. Remember Phil Donahue? I mean,
Right.
even Phil Donahue was pushing the narrative.
Yep.
And of course, Oprah took over, and all the others that were just like it. So then you've got fashion magazine, fashion industry, book publishing, all of these organizations. Many of them actually work together. We know that we have documented, meetings and things like that were held, especially to promote abortion, by magazine editors because they wanted to make it more attractive to women. So they all sort of put puff pieces and things like that into their magazines. Cosmo magazine was another one that fabricated all kinds of stories to fit the narrative. So it really just became the case that everything that we received, outside of our own families and churches and immediate communities was all the exact same messaging. They have controlled it and continue to control it.
It was a joint effort.
A community effort, I guess you could call it.
Many, many parts, but they played right into it. They played their part,
Absolutely.
didn't they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always been amazing to me the willingness of many men, good-hearted men who didn't necessarily want what feminists said was necessary, but felt they had to go along because of the story of victimhood that feminists very successfully told. I mean, it's amazing to read the Declaration of Sentiments, which says that the entire history of humankind is the history of man oppressing woman. I think the words are... it's a history of repeated injury and usurpation on the part of man against woman, the intent being to establish an absolute tyranny over her. And 32 men signed that document saying that was, they had participated in repeated injury and usurpation. It's just, it's really, that's, to me, in a way, the biggest mystery of the feminist takeover, the willingness to...
Well, and I think, though, actually my colleague Noah Mering just wrote a piece about this. It's in the Federalist, and she explains sort of the process of how this happened. I mean, she's talking about within the woke context, but you can absolutely see it within the feminist context as well. And I don't think we would have gotten to woke without feminism. But the fundamental piece is the pity piece. This victimhood piece is where it
Yes.
Yeah.
starts, and men feel badly, or they feel
Yeah.
regret, or they want to repair this. They want
Yeah.
this to be some sort of justice here. That's
Right.
where it starts. And of course, there's the fear factor of if you don't get involved in this, then you are a bad person, or you're a bigot, or you're labeled as somehow outside of the culture. And of course, women are famous for this, so, finding manipulative ways to instill fear in the hearts of men. And then the third piece is really force or coercion, where
Hmm.
it's these things are instituted into law, and then it's not only just a question of being ostracized, but it's actually doing things that are illegal. And we've gotten to that point with our own law. If you look at what sort of the Declaration of Sentiments was as asking for, so many of those things were like custody for children. Well, we can see the pendulum has swung the exact opposite direction, and men have no say in something like an abortion. They are generally not given custody of their children. The default position is really towards women. So you can see
Yep.
how, power has just shifted from one sex to the other. But that begs the question, well, what's the answer? Well, this is why the family is so important, because
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
these things are combined and brought into order instead of this, constant chasm between the sexes.
Indeed.
That's really exacerbated by the feminist movement.
Yep.
Mhm.
And fancy this, the women are not as happy today as they were before, right?
Yeah, I think that's really the saddest thing, and most women don't really know this data, partially because it's not publicized.
Right.
There's been some very
Right.
well done studies on it.
Right.
If you just even do a quick glance at things like depression rates, suicide, um, STDs, all of these
Yep.
kinds of areas that show sort of general happiness, you can see that women are really not happy. That
I
it's really
wonder
been
why.
dropped. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Tell women to just sort of worship themselves, and it's not going to go well.
Mm-mm.
So that's the real tragedy that I think, and one of the reasons that I'm really motivated to continue to do this research and to help women and men understand it, because I think for men, when they read this book, I think there's several things happen. One, they sort of feel like affirmed, like, okay, I'm not crazy. There's something
Mhm.
fundamentally wrong here. But they also come to a point where they realize that they need compassion towards women instead of bitterness or anger, because so much of this has just been passive. So much of it has just been things that we've been fed. We've never had an off ramp to say, you can think about this in a totally different way. It doesn't exist in the culture. And so that's been, I think, one of the really amazing things to see is just how it's softened men's hearts. Instead of the bitterness, it's sort of like, okay, I understand where this comes from. It doesn't obviously make it that much necessarily easier to deal with on a practical level, but at least you
Amen.
understand these women they don't necessarily want to be this way. They just don't know any other way to be.
Yes.
And I
And
think that's a win in a lot of respects.
once he understands that, he can help her come around
Right.
and see things in
Right.
a different way. I
Right.
I'll shut up. I won't say anything. But yes, I think that men are
No, but
able to
don't
do
do that.
that.
I think that's the
Men
important
can
thing.
stand up and stand their ground and say, "No, this is not. Look at the way you're acting. This is a problem." Not going, "Oh, you're a terrible bitch." La, 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 la." No, just real
Yeah.
clear. Men do this very well. No, no, honey, we have a problem here because X, Y, Z.
Yeah.
And you got to
Yeah.
do it over and over again. And sooner or later
Right.
she goes, "Oh shit, you're right." But it takes several times, sometimes 10
Yeah.
times. But this
Yes.
is what men are good at. They're very good
Yeah.
at.
Yeah. No. And having
Yeah.
been married for 15 years, I can say I have been on the receiving end of
There
that.
you go. There you
Or
go.
even just that, I think men just don't want to argue with women. I think that that's the fundamental
Mhm.
thing. And I think it's actually, in a certain respect, a perfection. I mean, even Adam didn't want to fight with Eve before the fall. So
Hmm.
I understand where it comes from, but I think that they're
Mhm.
definitely, women have to be sensitive to this as well and see, like, what happens when my husband just stops talking. What's how do I
Mhm.
what am I not cluing into here? It's not because I won the argument, but there's something that's happening that I need to pay attention to. This idea that we talk about, kind of this notion of submission and the difficulty of that. We
Yes.
see why women need to submit, because we naturally have this kind of power that if we aren't willing to get under the mission of our husband's life, if we're not willing to sort of work as a team and be a family, then we will rule the roost and we will cow him and basically silence him, and he will not feel like he's can do the role that he's meant to play.
Right.
So I think that that's an important piece that we need to recognize, is this is submission doesn't mean being a doormat. It means actively allowing ourselves to live under the authority of our husbands in a healthy, proper, ordered way, instead of being a doormat, and
in a loving way. And I'm telling you, when that happens, the love just goes back and forth, which most people don't understand. They don't get it, but it really does.
And the woman who cows her husband is not a happy woman anyway, because she develops contempt for him.
Yes.
So,
yes.
And the contempt is very mutual. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
It comes right back at you.
Over and over and over again about how she married a lemon. And, this older woman, she was near death, and she just told me story after story about how she married a lemon. And I just thought, oh my goodness, no wonder he was a lemon. Like, that she just crushed him over and over and over again.
Yes.
Yes. I'd be an alcoholic too if that were the.
And on that note, Carrie, it has been really enjoyable to talk today. I've learned some things and really enjoy your perspective on things. And
and it's a great book. Really recommend it to our viewers.
Yes, indeed. And we always end by saying, men
are
good.
Very good. Indeed. Well done. So we'll see you on the next one, guys. Thank you very much, Carrie. We'll see you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Carrie.
Men are good. Men are good, as are you.